Uh, are you all there in the class?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, because
Yes, ma'am.
yeah, why I'm asking you, you'll sometime back in the morning class, it so happened that I was just explaining and without realizing that I had lost connectivity. So there is little problem with the internet connection. So one minute. Unable to see the. One minute, girls. This was the last class. And how many of you attended yesterday's program?
Yes, ma'am.
Attended?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Very good. Was it useful?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. And did you all give the feedback?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
If you have not given, you please say no, because feedback is very important, so that we will improve on. If there is anything which you feel that the such kind of talks are not, you did not find it informative, then we should think on something else. But what we felt was, that was the need. It is required because all of you are in confused state. Should you take vaccination? Should you not take vaccination? And what is the side effects? If there are any side effects, is it going to affect us? And post viral, people who are having viral infection, or who are positive, how they should take care of their health. I'm sure by now all of you might have got some kind of mm, like some of your inner circle, in your family circle, would have got this infection. Correct? No? Am I correct, girls?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. One, somebody or the other, your uncle, auntie, cousin at home, somebody would have got infected, and you're seeing that you are coping up with such things. So, keeping that, we thought it would be best that if doctors come and talk, because when we talk or we give, we are giving you an information, like we are also gaining, but it is right from the frontline warriors. So what is the problem they are facing? That was our intention, and that is why this we had organized. And I'm happy that many of you had attended, and that is why we had to arrange through YouTube. And you can, if required, if you have any problems, we will share their contact numbers. You can reach out to them. If you want any kind of doctor advice, we have doctors, you can reach out to them. And most likely we will put it in the website. If you put it in the website, I think all of you can look for those doctors whom you can contact with. Okay, so shall we start with the class now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah. So for today's class, please make a note. All of you have a notebook next to you?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Very good. So please make a note. It is pollen embryo sac, or it is called as Nemec phenomenon. Okay. Now this was seen. I will just first explain to you, and then you can take down. So generally, what happens? How is a pollen grain formed? How is the pollen grain formed, girls?
By microspore mother cell.
Yeah, from microspore mother cell, you find a tetrad is formed, and that tetrads get separated, and it gives rise to the pollen grain. So you have a pollen grain which has, you know, two layers, outer exine, inner intine, and this pollen grain will undergo. So it undergoes microgametogenesis. So if you remember, microgametogenesis gives rise to two cells. What are those two cells?
Vegetative cell and germinative cell.
Vegetative and generative cells.
Yes, so it gives rise to a vegetative cell and a generative cell. So a normal pollen grain will undergo this division and give rise to vegetative cell and a generative cell. Okay, then take down this diagram. So take down the diagrams. Hyacinthus orientalis. So if you finish writing, you should tell me. Tell me, girls.
Done, ma'am.
Yes, then
Done,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Very good. Okay. So now this Nemec phenomenon or pollen embryo sac was first studied in Hyacinthus orientalis. Now this was the plant on which it was studied, and it was first studied by Nemec. Nemec is a Russian scientist. It was in 1898. At that point of time, he studied the abnormal behavior of the pollen grain. And what was the abnormal behavior is, he found that some of the pollen grains, normal conditions, generally the pollen grains would give rise to an unequal division, giving rise to generative cell and a vegetative cell. But to his surprise, he found that the pollen grains became large and they were 8-celled. So to study that, it was studied in detail, and he found that the pollen grains, instead of giving rise to 2 cells, gave rise to 8-cell stage, and that gave him a curiosity in learning. So what he did was, he studied, and he called it as pollen embryo sac, or he called it as Nemec phenomenon, because it was first identified by Nemec. So it was called as Nemec phenomenon, and it was studied in Hyacinthus orientalis. So in Hyacinthus orientalis, some of the pollen grains do not show the formation of the generative cells, or the generative cells get disintegrated. So when they get disintegrated, the vegetative cell undergoes repeated division, 2 divisions, and gives rise to an 8 nucleated stage. And by then what happens? There is an abnormal growth of the pollen grain. So the pollen grain takes up a shape of a big, a much larger sized, and the cells get 8 nucleated structure, which gets oriented towards the 2 poles. 6 nuclei move to the 2 poles, and the 2 remain in the center, just like how the embryo sac forms. So the structure is just like an embryo sac, but how he identified it as a pollen grain which is developing into an embryo sac was the left out structure of the exine wall layer. Because of the remnants of the exine wall layer, because now when the cell grows, the outer wall layer ruptures. So when that remnants of the wall layer, exine wall layer was there, with which he identified that this is nothing but it is a pollen grain which is growing into such an abnormal structure, and which gives an appearance of an embryo sac. So this embryo sac was further experiments were conducted, and it was conducted by Staw. Staw was another person after Nemec. The same kind of experiment was conducted to to study whether it is a right way to understand whether pollen grains behave like an embryo sac, behave like a female reproductive structure. And he also concluded that it was seen under Hyacinthus orientalis. Further, when he experimented in the lab with dusting pollen grains next to these embryo sac, he also found that the pollen grains developed pollen tubes and that were found to grow towards these embryo sac. That means, can you just tell what is the conclusion of this kind of experiment? Girls, are you all there in the class?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Ah. Did you hear what I said?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you understand what I was trying to say? A pollen grain becomes an embryo sac. So how it doesn't become an embryo sac, but it shows abnormal divisions. Understand that. So in Hyacinthus orientalis, it was seen that some of the pollen grains, if they had to give rise to gametes during microgametogenesis, it should have divided into two cells, generative cells and the vegetative cell. But the generative cell was not formed. Instead, the vegetative cell underwent two divisions, and that divisions gave rise to an 8 nucleated structure which resembled the embryo sac. But it was from the pollen grain, and so it was named as pollen embryo sac. This was studied in Hyacinthus orientalis by the scientist Nemec, and so it gets the name as Nemec phenomenon or pollen embryo sac. According to Nemec, he says that pollen grain will undergo a division giving rise to generative cell and a vegetative cell. The generative cell further divides and gives rise to the two gametes. That is a process of microgametogenesis. But due to some abnormal environmental conditions, or there could be some abnormal behavior of the pollen grain where the generative cell does not develop, but the vegetative cell, or the cell which is the vegetative cell, undergoes continuous division, giving rise to 8 cell nucleate stage, and that resembles that of the embryo sac, and hence he names it as pollen embryo sac. It was Staw who called it as Nemec phenomenon, because Staw confirmed the experiments of Nemec, that whatever Nemec said was right. It is Hyacinthus orientalis shows this abnormal behavior where if generative cells do not develop, then the vegetative cells divide and behaves like an pollen embryo sac. It behaves like an embryo sac. Why it is called pollen embryo sac? Because the it is developing from a pollen grain and also shows the remnants of the egg spine. Girls, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Further, to confirm Nemec's experiment, Starr subjected the pollen embryo sac with pollen grains, dusted some varieties of pollen grains, and he found to his surprise that pollen grains were attracted to the embryo sac. They started developing, pollen tube, and the pollen tube entered the embryo sac. So, what do you conclude from this? How do you analyze this experiment?
That pollen grain acted as a female.
Okay, it is acting as a very good pollen grain, which is a male structure, is behaving like a female reproductive structure. Yes. Then, how do you analyze? What else is happening? Why a pollen embryo sac develops?
Due to
Due
abnormal
to 8 cell stage, ma'am.
Yes.
Vegetative
Due to
cell will
8
undergo
cell
two
division.
divisions.
Vegetative cell undergoes two division. Then, so, wow, or how or why pollen embryo sac forms?
Ma'am, there will be 8 nucleated stage, no, ma'am. And the cells will arrange accordingly. So
Yeah,
it moves
that
as
is
embryos.
you're explaining the structure of a pollen embryo sac. Perfect. But I want to know why it develops.
Generative cell will get disintegrated.
Yes, correct. I think something else other person was telling. Who is that? Please tell your name.
Same thing, ma'am.
Yes,
I wanted to say the same thing, ma'am.
very good. So it is the abnormal behavior of the pollen grain. Why an pollen embryo sac is developing? Because the pollen grain is behaving abnormal. What is abnormal behavior? Generative cell is not formed. Understand that. So, if the generative cell, remember, when the generative cell forms, only then the generative cell will give rise to the male gametes. Because you know very well, vegetative cell does not contribute for the formation of the male gametes. Right?
Yes,
yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Girls? Ah. So when we say why pollen embryo sac is formed, you should be able to analyze the answer. So you can get a question as, please make a note. Every time it cannot be a direct question. According to Nemec, okay, according to Nemec, Hyacinthus orientalis, pollen grain develops into pollen embryo sac. Why? Why it develops? How it develops? How does a pollen embryo sac develops according to Nemec? So you should know pollen embryo sac develops because of the abnormal behavior. That means some of the pollen grains will behave abnormally. They do not develop generative cell, but the vegetative cell which is formed will divide and give rise to a large cell which is 8 nucleated, and that behaves like an embryo sac because the nuclei gets gets themselves placed in such a way that 6 of the nuclei or 6 cells move towards the 2 poles and other 2 remain in the center. So such a feature is seen and it is called as pollen embryo sac. So remember, when we say why this is formed, it is the generative cell which is responsible for the development of male gametes. And if the male gametes are not formed, then the vegetative cell goes into the formation of the pollen embryo sac. And remember, this embryo sac not only becomes 8 nucleated but also behaves like an embryo sac, behaves like a female gametophyte. It behaves like a female reproductive structure wherein it attracts the pollen tube, pollen grain, and the pollen tube enters into the embryo sac. So if generative cell does not develop, then this pollen grain can develop the feature of being a female reproductive structure. So that is the rare feature you find in Hyacinthus orientalis. Did you understand, girls?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you all understand?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Now, Nemec phenomenon is very, very important. You can get a 1-mark question. Nemec phenomenon is seen in dash. Which plant? Some list of plants they can give. What is Nemec phenomenon? That can be asked. Why a pollen embryo sac develops in Hyacinthus orientalis? Okay? These are all different ways of asking questions. You should be able to analyze it. Why a pollen embryo sac develops? Because it is from the generative cell which is disintegrating. If the generative cell develops, then it gives rise to the male gametes. If it does not develop, then it forms the pollen embryo sac. So formation of the generative cell is very, very important aspect. That is what it proves here. Understand that. Generative cell is very, very important. That makes the pollen grain fertile. Otherwise, it moves into the other sterile structure. Yes, girls? Did you understand?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Okay. So I want you people to take down this points. Please take down. Yeah, it will just take another 10 minutes. So I think we can have that. Okay. So in 1898, take down, Nemec noted that in the petaloid means colored, petal-like. You know, petals are always brightly colored. So petaloid means petal-like. Petaloid anther of Hyacinthus orientalis. It is put up there. Hyacinthus orientalis. The pollen grains sometimes form large 8 nucleated structures showing resemblance to embryo sac. I hope all of you are able to write.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Very good. Embryo sac. He believed that they arose as he believed that they arose as the result of a degeneration of the generative nucleus and three divisions. Girls, I told two divisions. Please make the correction there. 3 divisions. Yes, obviously it will be 3 divisions, right? One cell, when it divides into 2, 2 will divide into 4 and 4 divides into 8. That's how 8 nuclei are formed. So 3 divisions of the vegetative nucleus within bracket mitotic division. These are referred as pollen embryo sac. These are referred as pollen embryo sac. Next line. Please underline pollen embryo sac. Next line. Among 8 nuclei, 3 were found at opposite poles. 3 were found at opposite poles, and remaining 2 nuclei were present in the center. Full stop. As it was discovered by Nemec, for the first time, this phenomenon is referred as Nemec phenomenon. Next line. At first, the microspores girls, please mute. At first, the microspores increase in size to form large sac-like bodies, after which the nucleus undergoes three successive divisions to form 8 daughter nuclei. Of these 8 daughter nuclei,
Ma'am,
yes,
ma'am, can you please repeat, ma'am?
I will do it. At first, the microspores increase in size to form large sac-like bodies, comma, after which the nucleus undergoes 3 successive divisions to form 8 daughter nuclei. Of these, 3 lie at the end, where the exine is still intact, and 3 at the opposite end, and 2 in the middle. The 6 nuclei at the 2 poles organize into cells, while the remaining 2 fuse in the center.
Ma'am, can you repeat it again, ma'am?
I will repeat it. Am I too fast?
Last point, mom, that's all.
Yeah, I will repeat it. Yeah. Of these, 3 lie at the end, where the exine is still intact. 3 at the opposite end, and 2 in the middle. Full stop. The 6 nuclei at the 2 poles organize into cells. While the remaining 2 fuse in the center. The 3 cells near the exine end corresponds to the egg and synergids or synergids. Egg and synergids. And at the opposite pole, at the opposite end, don't make it as pole, at the opposite end as antipodals. So just listen. Towards the exine, in this region there, it is considered as, egg apparatus. I think all of you know this. And this side it is antipodals. Correct? This is
Yes,
the what is the middle one?
Polar nuclei.
Polar nuclei.
Polar nuclei, when they fuse, what is this? They're called as
Definite nucleus.
Definitive nucleus.
Definitive nucleus.
secondary
Nucleus.
secondary nucleus. They're called as secondary nucleus. Polar nuclei will fuse to form the secondary nucleus. And this, so egg apparatus will have, at the center it is the egg, and to the 2 sides it is the synergids, right? Yes. And below opposite pole it is the, so what they identified is that region where the exine is attached is the region where it has the egg apparatus, and the other side becomes the antipodals. Okay, so that is what we are explaining over here. Next line, take down. But according to Stowe, STOW, the vegetative nucleus does not undergo division to form 8 nuclei, but it is the division of the pollen nucleus. It is the division of the pollen nucleus which forms the pollen embryo sac. Now, did you understand? So, according to Stowe, this does not exist at all. He says pollen grain directly gives rise to this. So, when the pollen grain is developing abnormally, that pollen grain will not form generative or vegetative, but the nucleus of the pollen grain will directly give rise to the pollen embryo sac. So, take down. But according to Stowe, the vegetative nucleus does not undergo division to form 8 nuclei, but it is the division of the pollen nucleus which forms the pollen embryo sac. So once in the microspore, vegetative and generative cells are differentiated. Once in the microspore, vegetative and generative cells are differentiated, then the further development is normal. No pollen grains are formed. Also, the pollen embryo sac were usually accompanied. Also, the pollen embryo sac. Are you writing, girls?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So also the pollen embryo sac were usually accompanied by large number of dead pollen grains. So there would be many pollen grains which are, they just degenerate. And some pollen grains have shown this abnormal behavior. So dead pollen grains, underline. Next line. Stowe observed that when pollen embryo sac were placed in a nutrient medium, underline, under sterile lab conditions. Under sterile lab conditions means in vitro. Within bracket you can put it. Or agar medium. Together with some normal pollen grains of another variety the pollen tubes that were produced by normal pollen grains were found to coil around these pollen embryo sac were found to coil around these pollen embryo sac. Full stop. Next line. Once a sperm nucleus was also observed to be in the process of entering into the pollen embryo sac. Entering into the pollen embryo sac. Next paragraph. Thus, Staw says that all pollen grains are potentially capable of assuming either male or female reproductive structures. Full stop. Under normal conditions, the male potency, you know this, male potency. What is potency?
Capacity.
Capacity, yes. To behave like a male gamete. Male potency is dominant over female. So under normal conditions, the male potency is dominant over female, leading to the formation of vegetative and generative cell. Full stop. Later, the generative cell divides and two male gametes are produced. But at the abnormal conditions, which is due to the physiological, biochemical, and cytological, physiological, biochemical, and cytological, the female potency gets upper hand, or female potency becomes dominant, resulting in formation of embryo sac, pollen embryo sac, formation of pollen embryo sac. Now, did you all understand, girls?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Can any one of you summarize what we said for today? Just in, what Staw says? Any one of you? In 2 sentences, we can do it. Yes, girls?
Ma'am, Star says that there will be no formation of vegetative cell and generative cell. Directly, that pollen nuclei will give rise to the pollen embryo sac.
Very good. So, under normal condition, the pollen grain develops into vegetative cell and generative cell, which gives rise to the male gamete. Under abnormal conditions, pollen grain directly develops into the pollen embryo sac by 3 divisions. So there are 3 divisions which will take place, giving rise to 8 nucleated stage, and that 8 nuclei will get themselves organized just like an embryo sac, giving rise to egg apparatus, antipodals, and secondary nucleus, or the polar nuclei. So this was experimentally proven by Starr when he conducted the experiment by the pollen embryo sac was kept in a nutrient medium, subjected with some pollen grains, some other variety of pollen grains, and he found that there were pollen tubes which moved towards the embryo sac, and they coiled around the embryo sac, and he found that there were pollen tubes with the male gametes. So according to him, it is during normal conditions, when a vegetative and a generative cell is formed, the male potency is dominating. But during abnormal conditions, you find when the vegetative and the generative cells are not formed, then it is the female potency gets the upper hand or dominates, and that could be due to the variations like physiological, biochemical, or any cytological conditions. So the environmental conditions, the pollen grain itself, if it is a not proper formed pollen grain, then they may not form a proper male gamete. So in such conditions, it will give rise to a pollen embryo sac. So this is about Nemec phenomenon or pollen embryo sac. I hope all of you have understood, girls.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
yes, please go through once again. It is an important for 5-mark questions you can get, or you can just get a 2 marks question as to what is pollen embryo sac. So if what is pollen embryo sac is asked, then you should be able to say that when a pollen grain during abnormal condition gives rise to an 8 nucleated embryo sac, then it is called as a pollen embryo sac, and give the example as Hyacinthus orientalis. And please don't give example as Nemec. There are examples. I mean, we have come across the question paper, answer papers telling example Nemec phenomenon. Nemec phenomenon is pollen embryo sac. Example of the plant we want is Hyacinthus orientalis. Okay? Okay, girls?
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, ma'am.
Ma'am.
Yes. So shall we end the class for today?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So we will end the class. Yeah. And so girls, you can leave now. So have a wonderful day ahead. Take care of yourself. Girls, you can
Bye,
leave.
ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes.
Okay,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.